This week on Life and Faith.
But as one of my mentors says, but when you come to the edge of mystery and you don't quite know what to do, there's like a little thing in you that can jump. And I'm like, yeah. So that's the piece I've had to cultivate over time, which sometimes has gone quite well, other times it's not. But I've learned that even when it doesn't go well, I can be okay. My whole self and identity isn't wrapped up in the business I started or the position I hold now, which has been, kind of a long process of getting to that place too.
We have entered into an amusing ourselves to death moment in history.
It doesn't make sense to me. If there is God, God's supposed to be free.
I was 100% sure that I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only chance for happiness in this world.
Miracles don't necessarily change anybody's mind. They just get their attention.
And so I had to run with my child on my back, the ESA army coming behind us.
I said, gee, Uncle George, this is luxurious for a communist. Son, he said, nothing's too good for the worker. Nothing.
You're listening to Life and Faith from CPX, and I'm Simon Smart from Lockdown.
And I'm Justine Toe from my bedroom/recording studio. And I want to try out a thought experiment with you, Simon. I'm going to say a word, and I want you to tell me your gut reaction when you hear it, okay?
Yep.
So, entrepreneur.
Entrepreneur, to me, it sounds kind of flashy. Someone who's materially successful. They've had a crack at something amazing and it's gone really well, making them rich and prosperous, and they're nothing like me.
You probably have Elon Musk or something.
You're looking for?
I feel like it's a triggering word. Do you think it's a tall poppy thing? We just can't handle people big noting themselves, or is it something else?
Perhaps it is in my case, but of course it shouldn't be. I mean, when you say entrepreneur, all of us rely on and are influenced by, often in good ways, by people who have that entrepreneurial spirit. They want to kind of get out and have a crack, and they manage to pull things off. So yeah, I probably have to have a bit of self-reflection on that, and especially after today's episode. So Michaela O'Donnell Long, who we'll hear from today, has had to overcome that cringing response to the word entrepreneur every time she does a presentation or an interview. And Justine, you even brought up with her how awful the word entrepreneur made you feel.
It does. It makes me feel awful. And I mean, I think half because I feel it's quite pretentious in some ways, but mostly I reckon because it sounds really risky. I don't do risk very well. And I got the sense from Michaela that when you're an entrepreneur, everything is on the line every day. Although she did help me see it wasn't quite as black and white as that.
Okay, well, hopefully we haven't annoyed every entrepreneur in our audience, yeah. But it would be good to hear from her. So tell us about Michaela, first of all.
Well, she's an entrepreneur herself, and she writes and speaks about entrepreneurs. She did graduate studies into the sorts of habits and postures that make for a great entrepreneur, and we'll hear about those later in the program. But today she's a senior director for the Max De Pree Center for Leadership in North America, and there she runs initiatives for women in leadership as well as develops entrepreneurs. And she also has a business, Long Winter Media, which is like a video production and branding company. And it's this business that set her and her husband off on that entrepreneurial path. They graduated in the middle of a recession and couldn't find any other jobs, and so they thought, let's create something together. But they were newly married when they did that, so they had to navigate like lots of different challenges in this time together. Today they've got companies like Google, YouTube, NBC Universal as clients. I've given you a really kind of broad overview of the story, but the devil's really in the detail.
So here's Michaela O'Donnell Long to provide that detail.
So we had both graduated grad school and right in the middle of kind of a recessed economy and found work really hard to get. And like I said, he came from sort of this like kind of creative background. I came from a family of entrepreneurs. And so literally just like not a lot of work options. My solution was like, what if we turn the creative stuff you do into a business? And we did that in a very casual way at first, thought it would sort of be a side hustle. Within probably 3 months, it became our full-time work, which just showed me there was a need and a niche for that. So I we definitely over time, I kind of became like our creative visual director. He sort of stayed managing the film vertical, and I did a lot of our like client acquisitions, and still do, and kind of I have some other people on our team who do operations. So I say all that to say, like, the reason we got in was kind of out of necessity, and we both kind of found some different things that we were good at in the midst of it.
And you mentioned that there's an entrepreneurial streak in your family. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, good question. So both my parents have their own businesses. And just going back, even like one of my favorite stories about my grandmother, my mom's mom, she had 9 kids, and my mom tells a story of people like in fancy business suits sort of tripping over the toys and the toddlers in the living room to get to my grandmother's makeshift kitchen table office where she had kind of a bookkeeping and accounting business. So it's just sort of been in our DNA that when faced with what I do for work in the world, it's like, oh, we should probably start something, which is, that's just kind of how we're built.
See, this is a really interesting part of it, because I think you would want to say that to be an entrepreneur doesn't mean you have to have a specific kind of gift, let's say, for starting a business. But you do have a particular backstory, don't you? Like in your family that isn't maybe as intimidated as other people might be when it comes to starting something from scratch.
Yeah, totally. So certainly I was hardwired, like, to think that in the midst of not knowing what to do, that starting a business was the right idea. It took me a while to flesh out what that meant and what my own capacities were. And it turned out that I had the instinct to do that, but not necessarily all the built-in like mechanical skills to be great at that up front. Like I had to learn accounting, and I had to learn how to sell things to people, and I had to learn, how to manage team and how to fire people and hire people. Those things weren't built in. My solution to that sort of bigger like, what do I do? Was like many of us to sort of follow the path that I had seen other people do, which were mostly my parents.
And so at every step along the way, as you're acquiring new skills in order to run your business effectively, are you sitting there going, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm just going to take the next step?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Like, don't know what I'm doing, just going to take the next step, which is something I've heard a lot of people say, which applies to people who own their businesses and really applies to anybody who's trying to like take a bit of a path that isn't like taken every day. And if there's not models out there, people are kind of pressing against, okay, I want to do this, but how do I do it? So that was certainly me. I want to do this, but how do I do it? I had the built-in tools of like calling my dad on the phone and like having him like help me kind of sketch out like how much I would charge for the first thing I did and talking me through that. So that's a built-in luxury and sort of a resource, if you will, that not everybody has. But yeah, it was a step-by-step figuring it out, and it took me a while. It was hard, and there were a lot of starts and stops and a lot of failures, and because I worked with my husband, a lot of fights. Right, as you can maybe imagine.
Lots riding on that, right?
Yeah, and we started our business 6 months into getting married, and so it was like we actually got to know each other mostly because we worked together. I mean, we had been dating for a couple years, but you date for a couple years and you only know someone so much, and then it's like, okay, we're actually having kind of the fights that everybody would have in their marriage in some way, shape, or form. We're having them in our business, and we're learning how to communicate. We're learning how to disagree, how to be on different pages, how to get through tough moments. Which was kind of really ended up being a benefit and a blessing to us because we got to do that in that space and pre-kids. But like you said, there was a lot riding on it because it was like our income was like linked to each other. It wasn't like, oh, if one of us did poorly, the other one had our back. It was like, oh no, they're hinged together and we're going to like sink or swim as a team.
That's a huge thing to face.
Yeah, yeah, it was.
I don't feel any shame at all in telling you that the word entrepreneur makes me very scared.
Yeah, why?
And precisely for all those reasons that you just talked about, all the risk that you kind of absorb.
Yeah.
But I suppose that being exposed to all that risk has its own effects, which aren't necessarily that you're going to crash and burn.
Yeah. So risk is can still be scary for me, but my tolerance has certainly gone up. My tolerance was not immediately sky high because of my family. Even when we first started our business, I think we started it with like $2,000 worth of stuff that we sort of scraped together in equipment. It wasn't like we had somebody investing us that we were on the line to. So little by little, those risks added up. And Dan and I are both wired creatively, maybe even is a more root word than entrepreneurially. And we want to put things into the world that we imagine and don't see already in existence. And that is a very encouraging and energizing space for us. It's also very vulnerable. You got to put things into the world. And I find that most of the risk is actually in that vulnerability. So it's oh, what if this doesn't work out? What if this doesn't work out? And once I realized it's hard to be vulnerable, I'm oh, that takes a whole different set of tools than, okay, I'm afraid to take a business risk. And I'm also a big believer in I don't risk for the sake of risk. I'm not a thrill seeker. It's okay, what is, I would use the word prudent. So what is a wise and sensible risk where you've done the process of your homework and you've done the process of talking to people, but as one of my mentors says, but when you come to the edge of mystery and you don't quite know what to do, there's a little thing in you that can jump. And I'm yeah. So that's the piece I've had to cultivate over time, which sometimes has gone quite well, other times it's not. But I've learned that even when it doesn't go well, I can be okay. And my whole self and identity isn't wrapped up in the business I started or the position I hold now, which has been, kind of a long process of getting to that place too.
Hold on to that thought. A little later on, Michaela is going to expand further on identity and its connection to work. But at this point in the interview, Justine starts asking Michaela whether women tend to be less confident at navigating risk.
There's a particular expectations that come around just the image of what the narrative that's been passed down around what girls and women should aspire to be and look like and do, even if it's subtle, even if it's implicit, even if it's 5 layers down. I think girls can feel it. I was talking to my young daughter she's 3, and we were talking about police people, and she was oh, there's a policeman. I was well, what if it's a policewoman? She's women aren't police. I was wow, you've learned very early, by no words I have told to you, some rules about women, what we're supposed to not be, at least. And so when I think about confidence and the creative confidence, I do think that it's sort of been pushed out of and pushed down and made to live in a small, dark place that's hard to access. And so one of the things I find most encouraging is when I am with women who know how to access that and have done the work or have, kind of been exposed to voices or for whatever reason, they've sort of reclaimed that. And I find so much hope in meeting, and I actually meet a lot of them. I meet a lot of women who have reclaimed that hope, but I do think there's a reclaiming process that has to happen, that is particularly more difficult for girls.
It seems that you regularly get consulted about women in leadership positions, women in business. What would you like women to know in order to take a leap or to back themselves or to lean into risk?
Yeah, I think, again, there's sort of 2 levels of change there. I'll say even 3. One is within an individual woman, right? So sort of kind of naming the forces that hold back confidence, or naming the forces that make her feel like she's in isolation, and kind of figuring out how one might take kind of the initiative in their own life to baby step out of that. But that's only as good as the system in which you're in is hospitable to you sort of baby stepping out of that kind of box that you're in. And sometimes you're in certain systems, you're wow, everybody's super welcoming, and here I go, and I've got all the kind of runway in the world. And other time, and which of course enables people to take more risks. And then other times, you're met with the antibodies of the system, and it's nope, we're sort of built to shut that down. And in that regard, I feel a 3rd layer becomes really important, and that is just the more close-knit or intimate community that a woman sort of has, which is, takes all kinds of shapes and forms. But I have been particularly enriched by other, I'll say, like-minded colleagues who are navigating a similar set of realities as me. So we're able to bounce stories off each other. We're able to sort of call something out and be like, wow, that was sort of like, not a good thing that happened there, and brainstorm together sort of maybe how to work around it. And that has actually probably been the most formative agent of change for me personally. So it's like, yes, I can do some individual stuff and definitely push the margins. The system itself, I think, is a bigger ship to turn, but there's room there, and we all have our own kind of organizations that we're working within, or ecosystems that we're working within, especially if you're sort of out on your own, that are sometimes more hospitable to that pushing. And at the end of the day, I found the most rest and the most hope and the most tangible feedback about how to make sense of it all through a community that I've worked pretty hard to cultivate. It's not like that I just have this built-in, 6-person woman crew who is there every time I call them. It's taken years, and decades to cultivate those relationships and those friendships. So I think on all three of those levels, it's important to consider.
You're listening to Life and Faith from CPX. We're talking with Michaela O'Donnell Long about being an entrepreneur and, especially if you're a woman, navigating risk in the business space.
We turn now to ideas about feeling called to do a particular kind of work. And I have the best clip ever to set the scene for that discussion. This is a quote by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, read by one of the US's most successful lady entrepreneurs ever, Oprah Winfrey.
The way to discover what you were put on earth for is to go back into your past, list the times you felt most fulfilled, and then see if you can draw a line through them. What have you truly loved thus far? What has ever uplifted your soul? What has dominated and delighted at the same time? Assemble these revered objects in a row before you, and perhaps they will reveal a law by their nature and their order, the fundamental law of your very self. Yeah. I've always said, if you look back at your life and connect the dots, there's a pattern of the things that made you feel fulfilled.
Yeah. That's Oprah reading out a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche that's featured in The Second Mountain, written by New York Times columnist David Brooks. And I think we've just ticked one of Justine's life goals right there by featuring that combination of talent on Life and Faith.
Yeah, you have no idea, really. I think it's a moment for me. Yeah. I think what Nietzsche says is so powerful because it's instantly recognizable. I mean, Oprah gets it, and Oprah, of course, is not a mere mortal, really, but she gets it and I get it, right? But at the same time, what I find really interesting is the way Michaela goes on to challenge this idea, or maybe she updates it, right, for a changing world of work. But we're going to get to that. But first, here's Michaela talking about where the idea of calling comes from.
Most of the time when we say vocation, and it's sort of most widely used sentence refers to a job people have had. But that word has a longer history. And it actually comes from a Latin word, which basically means to be called. And in Christian theology, Christians would assume that God is a caller of humans, that God is kind of calling people to follow God, and that God is, in other ways, calling people to other people, to specific tasks sometimes, to places, to even, geographical locations, and that God is an active agent in us sort of making sense of those particular realities of our existence.
So I guess when you might hear people say, I really feel born to do this job, let's say, there's some kind of Christian resonance to that sort of idea. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, totally. I hear that a lot. Like, I'm born to do this. I'm made to do this. Another way of saying that might be, I feel alive. And so when people say, I feel born to do this, it's sort of a reflection, at least in Christian theology, of kind of their drawing towards their own being made in a particular way. I've heard, it's kind of this person I look up to talks about it in terms of identity, belonging, and purpose. And so when we get into the I'm born to do this, that really taps into that purpose. And I think humans, everybody I've met is hungry to have a purpose, is hungry for the ways they spend their days to matter. Whether that's I hunger to matter to the people in my family, I hunger to matter, kind of in a spiritually significant way to God. I hunger for my work or my job to have meaning. It takes different shape for different people, but I certainly think that humans are hardwired to long for meaning.
It's a really lofty and beautiful vision, but I can't help feeling that there's been such drastic changes in the world of work. The rise of the gig economy, the rise of casualization. Is it, no one's going to necessarily be saying, I was born to drive this Uber. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
So what sense do we make of that sort of vision for work in the sort of current circumstances of work that we're living in?
I have noticed that there's almost like a purpose crisis right now. And I'd say for at least the generation, people have been thinking that in their work in particular, that there is opportunity for them to sort of live out their purpose, right? Which sort of signifies that they have an individual purpose that makes the most sense in their life. But when you have somebody who changes jobs 11 times in their career, 17 times, who thinks they're in a great position and then gets kicked to the curb because the financial models have changed. And actually, Christian theology in its most basic form doesn't support the fact that the thing that we get paid to do is the sole location where we ought to make sense of that idea of feeling called to do something. But if we have kind of that bucket of, okay, we're going to live out our purpose at work, or we have to even find our purpose at work, that's just a lot of pressure to put on that in a dynamic world of work. It's kind of a house of cards waiting to come crumbling down. And I think it is coming crumbling down for a lot of people. So we just put these particular pressures on work. It's got to be a place where I live out my sort of, kind of biggest sense of meaning. It's got to be a place where I'm passionate. It's got to be a place where I'm sort of fulfilling my unique attributes or giftings as a human. And in a changing world of work, when everything looks different every couple of years, I think that's a pressure that's unrealistic. I say a lot that we're sending people into a new world with old tools, which leaves them ill-equipped to make good on what every college commencement speaker has asked them to do, which is go and change the world. And so people are sitting here with these old tools, which are mostly old because of how rapid the world is changing, and trying to make sense of all of that in one sphere is limiting. I have found that when I think about calling as a bit of I'll say, more limited thing in terms of time, so in terms of seasons, what am I sensing I'm called to in this season? Or who am I sensing I'm called to? Or where am I sensing I'm called to? That opens up that for a bit. So I want us to go wider. And, I think about the word dynamic. So several years ago, we used to build websites at our company. This was 8 years ago. And the big question of then was do you want a static website or do you want a dynamic website? Static meaning once you build it, that's what it is. Dynamic meaning it assumes that you're going to want to move and change a lot. We have mostly approached calling and even sometimes work as a static reality when it really is much more of a dynamic reality given economic realities and even the Christian theology of calling.
Now, I promised that we'd return to the findings of Michaela's doctoral research later on in the program. Well, that time is now. She interviewed many entrepreneurs for her PhD and researched the kinds of practices that really prepared them for the entrepreneurial life. You might be surprised to learn what she found.
So at first I wondered if I was going to find all these fancy practices, entrepreneurs get up at 5 a.m. and they're super productive and they do all these things. And what I found instead were some things that were very human. Top of the list is that the people that I research, like they regularly practice empathy. Now there's a lot in Silicon Valley and in kind of like design thinking that talks about empathy as the way to understand your customer needs and therefore build something that they want. That's certainly true. But the people I talked to, they didn't do empathy at a distance. They did empathy up close, and they practiced it. So the first practice is empathy. The second one I'll sort of name is what I might call like embracing risk and failure. Every single person I talked to who were kind of meet a bunch of benchmarks of success were way more comfortable describing themselves as people who sometimes failed and learned than as people who were successful. And that really told me something. Like, first of all, that they saw themselves ever in progress. Second of all, that they weren't afraid of what happened when kind of things didn't go right, that maybe they had this kind of more rooted or tethered or spread out identity that wasn't solely about the work and the projects, which let them kind of differentiate a little bit and take some of these risks. But yeah, the two most prominent things are that absolutely regularly practicing empathy kind of along the way of where they already were, and that they embraced risk and failure. I should say on the risk and failure thing, it's not that they were all doing these like grandiose risk. It's that they kind of like, it's not the proverbial version of jumping off a cliff. It's like these small things, like trying small things, seeing what happens, and that in trying the small things, having some things not work and work, they build up the muscles and the tolerance to withstand bigger risks.
Can you tell us some stories about lady entrepreneurs who've made it happen for themselves?
Yeah, one of the things I'm most encouraged about here is I think as kind of culturally, women are labeled and or marked as like naturally empathetic, and then they're told sort of when they're in kind of the business setting that they need to put that aside and be like businessy in order to succeed. And the stories that I got, especially of the women entrepreneurs, and the men too, honestly, but it came out loud and clear with the women, is that those things weren't separate. The practice of empathy wasn't separate from the business. In fact, it's what fueled it, right? So I'll tell you one story of a woman named Sarah. She was on a trip with her family, and they were down in Guatemala in South America, and she happened upon these women who were sewing, and they were sewing these different blankets, and there were these vibrant, bright colors, and there were a lot of women and a lot of blankets. So she sort of stopped in, and she was like, "What are you doing? And how much are these?" And they said, they gave her a dollar amount that was sort of equivalent to about $5 US. And when she looked at it, she's like, "Whoa, this is worth way more than $5 US. And like, why are they undercharging for it so much?" So she asked them, and they said, "Yeah, like this is the main skill that we have, like that women for generations in our community have been taught, is how to do this like very intricate weaving. But like no one wants to buy it. So we just, none of the tourists want to buy it, and nobody else in our community wants to buy it. So we just keep lowering the price. So one of these blankets might take us 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and we're charging $5 for it. And because there's no like profit, and because it's such hard work for like literally nothing, like the thing that makes us the most sad is that our kids, like they're uninterested in learning these techniques. So we're going to lose like a 1,200-year-old, like, kind of identity as a people because we can't find a way to sort of, it's no longer relevant or sustainable. And so she was like, oh, like, and when I talked to her, she's like, really what broke my heart, and this is like kind of where I signaled in that she had, there was, kind of the empathy piece. She's like, it's just that like, that whole community was like losing that like piece of dignity, and it's just like dignity from their own work. And so she's like, she thought to herself, what if, which by the way, that's a very like entrepreneurial question, like the what if question. She's like, what if I somehow marketed these in the US? And she had a little bit of a background in like fashion. And she's like, I think what I know is that if I just change these sort of couple colors, these designs are actually like very like, they would be in high demand. So she asked the women, she didn't just sort of demand it of them, but she said, would you be willing to change these couple of colors? And I'll bring you these fabrics, and we could do a small experiment together. And we're not going to like open up a whole shop or a whole line, but I'm just going to get like a half a dozen blankets and see if I can sell them. Well, she was able to sell the first half a dozen blankets for closer to $200 or $300 in the States. So immediately she was like, okay, there's something here. And so they experimented then with some pillows and then with some napkins and sort of kept going. And eventually new co-ops opened. But most important to Sarah was that the kids became like interested in like learning this like craft and trade, and that sense of dignity was restored, not by anything Sarah had done magically, but by just sort of opening up access to something that was already there and maybe making one small collaborative tweak. And so, that kind of choice to take that empathy, convert it into imagination, and then start in these small ways. Like, I have seen so many women do different versions of that. Now, Sarah has like a sort of a company where she has these textiles, but I've seen people do it in small ways in their family or in the workplaces they're already in. It really opens up the doors to possibilities when they're sort of capitalizing on the very thing within them that they've, but on one hand told to be empathetic, and on the other hand told to leave at the door when they're doing business. So to me, that's a very hopeful and encouraging reality and model that I've seen.
And maybe a superpower that women have.
It's absolutely a superpower. In best case scenario, women use that superpower. It does add a dose of world-changing flavor, and that it's something that, you know, all humans practice more.
You've been listening to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart with Justine Toe.
Thanks so much to Anglican Deaconess Ministries, or ADM, for giving us the chance to speak with Michaela O'Donnell Long.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, do us a favour and send it along to others who you think might enjoy it. Maybe a female friend who could use a nudge along her entrepreneurial path. We're working hard to contribute to a positive conversation about faith, meaning, and the things that matter. Everything we produce here at CPX seeks to do just that, and it's all made possible by supporters who donate to us. And we'd love you to consider doing just this. Every bit counts. Go to lifeandfaithpodcast.com to find out more. Next week, what kind of person do you imagine Paul was? He's certainly a passionate person, wasn't he?
This is where I'm very caught. You know, when I talk about what a fiction writer can do is very, very different to what a theologian does. So you're asking me, who is my Paul? My Paul has to be drawn from within my own battles with faith. So my Paul is someone who knows shame really, really deeply. My Paul knows what it's like to be in a world where meaning is to be married, to have children, to lead this life. What if you don't do that? I think there's vanity in Paul. I think there is a cantankerous side to him, and I think that, you know, that's in the letters. Like, you know, he's arguing all the time. He thinks he has the truth. But I also think there must be something about Paul who experienced deep love. Even though I don't call myself Christian, I step a little bit outside that, and we can talk about that, who clearly knows something about grace and love that comes from God.